This is the first video in my new guide to a bespoke suit series, so I'm making this video so that we're all starting at the same speed, so that when I say things we all know what I'm blabbering on about, and it also includes some other relevant information about the tailoring industry. Firstly, common terms I use. This isn't a glossary with 101 terms that tailors use. This is to get you started with the absolute minimum effort, but so that you can also follow along. Firstly, baste. There are two terms of this, two uses of this. Baste as a verb is to use a weak cotton thread to stitch two things together before machining or hand sewing them, for which we use, as one might expect, basting thread. And baste as a noun is when a garment is put together to be fitted to a client. You can make a baste to make adjustments very easily in patterns, rather than finishing an entire garment and realizing that the sleeve or whatever is too long, looking at you over there. Basting it for a fitting gives us the opportunity to truly fit clothes to a person, and this is a lot of what makes it bespoke. Back tack can be a verb or a noun, when we are on a machine and we start sewing and we go back over where we started in order to prevent the thread from pulling out. We very often back tack, but I think I'm pretty clear when we don't back tack. We usually back tack at the start and end of stitches, but I usually mention it. If I don't, you can see. Tack is similar to a back tack, but largely used with hand sewing. It functions the same. When we start a stitch, we do at least 2 stitches in the same place to fasten the thread down to the fabric so that we don't pull it out. I think it's largely superior to knotting thread, especially in finishing, because, well, I'm not sure whether it's more secure, but it's flatter and less dense. If we need to tack thread, I will usually say a synonym of tack, because of all the hundreds of pages and thousands of words I've written, it gets boring using the same words over and over, so you might notice I open a thesaurus occasionally. I'll say more, anchor, or something similar to tell you to do a back tack before and or after we start or finish a stitch. Seam allowance is a noun. This is how much larger the fabric is than the finished product. The amount of fabric that we have that we can use to sew the fabric. Most often using metric, and in the patterns I'm using, the seam allowance is 1 centimeter. This means I'm usually stitching 1 centimeter from the raw edge of cloth unless there's inlay. Inlay, which is a noun, is what allows us to have fittings and ensure correct fit and change it when we need to, and to increase the size as well as reduce the size of a garment. Inlay is extra fabric that we leave beyond the seam allowance so that we can move seams if we need to get a better fit. Then we can later adjust the size of the garments more easily as well. So we usually leave it when we finish it as well. Inlay is also why we're stuck with mark stitching our cloth that we cut out. Inlay is put in strategically. The common amount to put in is 2.5 centimeters, but sometimes it can be more than that for a baste, and it would be cut away later for the finished product. So when I add inlay, when I'm cutting out patterns, I am adding cloth beyond the seam allowance, usually. Basically, as an aside, I want to say that hack it out is a term that I hear a lot more often than I would expect as a tailor. So just cutting out around some other cloth. I also want a word about grain, weave, warp, weft, bias and selvage. I'm no expert, so correct me if I'm wrong. Weave is the individual yarn on the horizontal and vertical that makes up the fabric. The grain is like along those yarns and or threads, basically at right angles. The selvage is the raw edge on the long side of the fabric. This is on both edges of the fabric when it's woven before it's folded in half along the fold. The selvage is made such that it stops the cloth from fraying on either side. In lining, we'll often use the selvage along the bottom of the trouser lining because it's the least bulky and most effective way of preventing it from fraying away over time. Who and where it was woven, and usually the material, the specific weave and the superstatus. Along the same grain as the selvage is the warp. A good way of remembering the warp is warp, walk. The warp has strength and the least give. It can't be stretched as much. And 99% of the time when I say the straight grain, I'm talking about the warp. The weft is the width, and it has more stretch than the warp. The bias is at a 45-degree angle to the both of them. As you come off of the warp or the weft, there is more and more stretch until you get to the true bias, which is the 45-degree angle, where you have the most stretch in the cloth. This applies to almost all suiting fabrics that don't have an artificial stretch from elastane or anything like that. We need to know this because we use the bias of fabrics to stretch them. Almost more importantly is that a lot of seams that we cut aren't on the warp or the weft, they're somewhere in between. Hence, there's a certain amount of stretch in all of the edges. We need to be careful of this sometimes because when ironing and sewing, we might stretch and pull them, thereby changing our pattern. Something important to note that can be easy to be confused by is when tailors will say right side or wrong side or correct side of the fabric. All fabric will have a side that we are working with and a side that we aren't. The side that we want to have showing on the outside of our project and the inside. As tailors, when we cut fabric, it is always doubled up. Usually about 1.5 meters total, about 75 centimeters folded. This way we cut 2 of each piece whenever we cut anything out. The side that we want to show on our finished project is always on the inside so that it is protected better and it has spent its lifetime being protected better. This is what we are talking about almost literally every time we say right side. The right side of a cloth, not the side on the right, not the right piece. Its use is almost interchangeable with correct side. The other side won't usually be seen at all on the finished project and will often be referred to as the wrong side. I leave this in because I don't want anybody getting confused. We almost exclusively chalk on the wrong side. We always mark the wrong side of the fabric with a chalk strike or an X so that we don't get confused and accidentally make 2 identical pieces instead of 2 mirror images. Now I want to spare a word for cutters, makers and finishers. I think this is important to know because this is how the tailoring industry works. And I know I sure got confused when I was going around Savile Row and they were talking about cutters and makers, how they cut them here and made them there, etc. So how the tailoring industry works, it's split into 3 main jobs: cutters, makers and finishers. A person can be a cutter, a maker or a finisher. A cutter is who meets the client, takes their measurements, and provides the material, buys the fabric. A cutter makes the pattern for the client, and they'll buy and cut out the fabric. The responsibility of the cutter is fluid. There can be partnerships between cutters and makers where the cutter might do more, or the maker might basically be outsourced and they just get the cutout pieces. The maker will put together the pieces. They are usually specialised, so you've either got jacket makers, trouser makers, waistcoat, shirt, etc. The relationship between the cutter and a maker might be they both work for the same company and work just gets passed between them. Or the cutter and maker might be both independent, they both work for themselves, and the maker is commissioned. If they are commissioned, it is usually an ongoing relationship where one found the other. The maker might have their own particular method of making a trouser, jacket or whatever. They agree on a method of communicating the features that the cutter offers their clients, which I imagine is just a case of the cutter saying, "This is my check sheet, do you have any questions?" Finishers can be in-house, working directly for the makers, or outsourced again. I'm told that makers don't often like to share the identity of their finishers because good finishers are hard to come by. I expect most, if not all, makers can properly finish their work themselves, but it is most cost efficient to outsource. Personally, I want to learn how to do all of this. I want to be able to make a suit from the fabric to the very last stitch. I once called it a virtuoso, but I'm quite sure that's what a master tailor is. It is often best to specialise. You will always make more if you can basically act as part of a production line. A cutter can cut more because they aren't making, a maker can make more because they aren't finishing, and a finisher, you get the idea. I'm told that if you want to be a cutter, it's best to first train as a maker, so a jacket maker specifically, I'm told, so that you can have a firm grasp of what is and isn't possible when it comes to turning 2D to 3D, which I think is perfectly encapsulated in my jacket drafting and then cutting videos. I learned a very valuable lesson in seam balance making that jacket. Right, wrong, and different methods, something that I feel is quite important to touch on. Basically, there are no wrong ways of making something or doing something if the end result is the same or at least comparable. One tailor might do something that others don't. This doesn't make them wrong for doing it. And another tailor might cut out a step completely. I mean, so long as they aren't cutting out like the side seam. And even if every other tailor does it, this doesn't mean they're wrong for cutting it out. It's important to know that there are many different methods for everything, and you can't just say it's wrong. You should keep an open mind to alternative methods. Metric versus Imperial. In England, I know that all tailors, excluding those from other countries like the Italians around these parts, and the Scottish use some combination of both. In England, all tailors work in Imperial. So all tailors on and off the Savile Row work in inches. Why this is important to note is that there is a blanket rule in this country that says we need to be taught in metric measurements. Therefore, I have learned completely in metric, and I present my technical guides completely in metric, although sometimes it is easier to say an inch rather than a quarter decimeter. But to be fair, there is a bit of a grey area since I intern with a trouser maker and all the seam allowances are 1 centimeter, so not sure what to make of that. But as much as I am able, personally, metric measurements in my tailoring. But be aware that cutters and tailors in this country all work in Imperial.